If you're in your 20s, say, or late teens or 30s, and you go to Mass, then you've had to be swimming against the tide, or you wouldn't be there. You'd be ticking no religion with everyone else, right? Not only have you had to kind of argue with friends at the pub or whoever, members of your own family, you've had to argue with a bit of yourself as to why am I doing this? What does it mean to me? But you find yourself in a room full of 200 of these fellow kind of countercultural tide swimmers. And that's when you start to see these kind of creative minority effects.
Welcome to Into the Truth. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Stephen Bullivant today, Professor at St Mary's in southwest London, or just outside southwest London. You're the Professor of Theology and Sociology of Religion,
yes.
Which is a very interesting kind of intersection of subjects which we'll discuss. So one of the reasons that we're speaking is that you have just written an introduction for us, or a foreword rather, to a book by Bishop Robert Barron. So do you want to say a little bit about the book and about what your introduction kind of brings to the party there?
Yeah, so it's Bishop Barron very kindly wrote an introduction to a book of mine. So it was nice to repay the favour. There's some listeners, will be aware that there's a Eucharistic revival, there's national Eucharistic revival kind of happening in America. So the idea was, and there was a study by the Pew Center who do a lot of kind of very well done nationally representative surveys of religion and public life. And there was a particular survey done a few years ago that suggested that a certain worryingly small proportion of American Catholics believe that the Eucharist is really, really the body and blood of Christ. And it was off the back of that. I think at the time Bishop Barron was the chair of the evangelization committee for the Bishops' Conference in America, and therefore was a driving force in that we need to do something about this. We need a kind of a big, not just catechetics, well, that's important, but actually to engage Catholics and young Catholics particularly with Eucharistic piety, because it can be so powerful. And that there's a sense that we've lost some of that in the previous decades. Now, obviously, with that as the jumping off point, this book is written as a kind of the companion book for the revival, and I think it was the intention was that parishes could buy it in bulk and give it to everyone, and it's very short, it's very engaging, it's beautifully written, and Bishop Barron is an extremely engaging and profound thinker, and it's just a great presentation of the Catholic vision of the Eucharist and why it matters, and then. However, given that it was created for a particular socio-religious context in the States, when it was published in this country, CTS honoured me with the invitation to write a kind of a short introduction contextualising what we know about Eucharistic beliefs among the Catholics in England and Wales, or Britain more generally. And actually...
Well, listen, we'll come back to the details of that in a bit later in the podcast. But I just wanted to start really hearing a bit of your story, because you've become the kind of Catholic statsman as well as the theologian of note. But you didn't start off that way, did you?
No, not at all. So there's the potted version of this story, which there's a long, boring version, but the short version sounds more dramatic than it kind of felt at the time. Was, I was raised like a lot of people in this country, raised in a non-religious household, not baptized, which this is the mid-'80s, so it was still fairly common to be baptized, if nothing else, right? C of E by default kind of thing. Family aren't Catholic. But it was a time, so things have changed a lot. But there was quite a lot of ambient cultural Christianity. So I went to non-faith state schools, but primary school we were taught the Lord's Prayer. We did proper hymns every morning in assembly, straight down the line nativity play, harvest festival. There was a lot of kind of quite weak, vague Christianity kind of that you could imbibe passively, which actually I think has an inoculating effect. I think actually what it's kind of you take in enough dead strains and it prevents you ever kind of catching it seriously. Now, I didn't want to go to the Catholic sixth form in Preston, raised in Preston, very Catholic, waned Catholic heartland.
Town,
exactly.
Yeah.
Didn't want to go to the Catholic sixth form because it was Catholic, and obviously Catholics are kind of stupid and evil. And ended up going partly because it was a nice place, a lovely place, but also because it was the only of the sixth forms that did philosophy, which should have told me something about at least the stupid bit, if not the evil bit. That came later. So when it wanted to go to university, I wanted to do archaeology. Went to Oxford to do classical archaeology and ancient history. A few weeks in, wasn't enjoying it as I thought I would. And any other university in the country that does philosophy, I could just have done philosophy, right? In Oxford, you can't just do philosophy. You have to do it with something. And the only something I was qualified to do it with, I couldn't do it with maths or physics. I could do it with theology because I'd done A-level philosophy. I could tick that box, and you didn't have to have any specific religious studies background. Now, I was an atheist at this time. If you see pictures of me, I've got a Che Guevara T-shirt, Chinese Communist Army jacket, reading. I would have called myself a logical positivist. You can imagine how much fun that was, 18. But I thought, well, just fine, I'll do the minimum theology. But first time I'd ever read a gospel. First time I'd ever have to engage seriously with the Christian intellectual tradition. First time I'd ever hung out with bright, committed Christians. Fell in with Dominicans, started drinking with Dominicans, being invited to boozy guest dinners at the Dominican house in Oxford. First mass I ever went to was, in order not to miss pre-dinner drinks, you have to go to mass beforehand because they know what they're doing. So it sort of segues in. So long period of time, it was the theology that interested me. Went from thinking it's literal nonsense to thinking, well, it's false but interesting, to thinking, I'm beginning to get to the point where I can see myself becoming a Catholic. By this point, I'm doing a doctorate on 2 sentences in Lumen Gentium, right? So it's like, I'm on a journey. Like, looking back, I was obviously, like, on a journey. And then I met an Australian Benedictine at a party who, it was just that moment, well, I needed to go to Rome the following year to do some archival research for the doctorate. I mentioned, I can see myself becoming a Catholic sometime, who knows? And he said, right, well, next year I'll be in Rome. Come out, stay with us, do your research, and we'll baptise you at St. Paul's outside the walls. So that's what we did. And then my wife, I was married by that point.
So you became a truly Roman Catholic.
Yeah. She was and then entered RCIA sort of 2 years later. So yeah, we've not looked back.
Brilliant. And then what? You went straight into teaching within a Catholic university. Yeah,
finished my doctorate in theology. Didn't have a great deal lined up for jobs, and then 11th hour got a part-time temporary post at St Mary's, and I've been there 15 years. And then along the way, now the sociology comes in because my doctorate was on the Catholic theology of atheism, and if I was going to study the theology of anything, I'd want to read the sociology of it, the psychology, the philosophy, right? And there was very little sociology of atheism written. It was a period, so I began my doctorate just when the new atheism kicked off. So The God Delusion was published probably the month I started the doctorate on atheism. So there was interesting things happening, right? So I ended up doing little bits of sociology on the side, but then obviously, especially as a new convert, very interested in theology, interested in the sociology of secularity and unbelief and non-religion, very interested in the new evangelization. The sociology and the theology kind of have melded very happily ever since to understand the pastoral context that that the church is kind of called to live out in at the present time. So yeah,
Well, and I suppose there's a lot of story to tell in terms of the numbers and what's kind of happening to Christianity in particular in this country. I mean, the big news kind of recently was that we had the national census, and for the first time Christianity was sub 50%, I think, isn't that right?
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, that wasn't a surprise. Depending on how you ask the question, which makes sense in a secularizing context, because an awful lot of people are raised with a bit of mostly Christianity. They say, well, technically I was baptized, and we were married in church, I guess, and but they can tell a totally different story about, well, we don't really believe that, and I don't think my parents ever did, and I certainly don't agree with the church on this, and frankly, I don't even know where the church is, where we go. So depending on how you phrase the question, you can kind of tip quite a big chunk of the British population to tick one box or another.
Okay.
But yeah, it's no surprise to anyone that the default setting in Britain is no religion now. It used to be the default setting was Church of England unless you had a particular reason to be something else.
Yeah.
Now it's no religion unless you have a particular reason to be something else.
Okay. So, in a sense, we've moved from a kind of cultural Christianity to a much more how can we put it, sort of deliberate Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. And
which I think could be considered a good thing.
No, it is. It's good and bad. But I think that the real pastoral silver linings here is that actually, I think from what we talked about before, I do think that kind of being raised with a very kind of weak version of Christianity around prevents people ever taking it seriously, right? As something new and radical and life-changing, right? Because they think, we know that. We went to however many years of Church of England school or Catholic school, and it was boring and doesn't mean anything. What you get is, a couple of generations after that, you've got people who can encounter it as something new. But also, and this is one of the really interesting things that we're beginning to see, is that for the youngest generations, if you're in your 20s, say, or late teens or 30s, and you go to Mass, then you've had to be swimming against the tide, or you wouldn't be there. You'd be ticking no religion with everyone else, right?
Yeah.
Now, not only have you had to kind of argue with friends at the pub or whoever, members of your own family, you've had to argue with a bit of yourself as to why am I doing this? What does it mean to me? But if you then find yourself Catholics at universities are the classic example, but there's plenty of others. You find yourself in a room full of 200 of these fellow kind of countercultural tide swimmers. And that's when you start to see these kind of creative minority effects kind of kicking off.
I mean, and that's a kind of a very interesting sort of section of your introduction. So let's start a bit with the stats that kind of gave rise to this Eucharistic revival, and in a sense, I mean,
what I wrote.
Sorry,
I forgot what I wrote.
Okay, well, look, I mean, the Pew survey came back with a stat that basically said, I think it was over 60% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence. Now, obviously, as you said, there are kind of methodological issues about how one asks a particular question. But I mean, it doesn't feel wrong in that sense, that I mean, sometimes you go to Mass, you just look at the communion kind of queue, and you realise that for whatever reason, and I mean, it's always difficult to judge, though that doesn't mean that we don't do it. Why people are kind of acting in a certain way, or maybe not being as reverent as we could be. So, I suppose one question is those numbers. I mean, they sound about right to you, and if so, why do we think that that's the case? And are these sort of statistics, are they kind of useful to us? What can we do with them?
Yeah, I mean, the real kind of central plank of the introduction to this is that the British numbers look better.
Okay.
Right? And
which is sort of surprising, but in another sense.
Yeah, because America's a much more religious place generally, and depending on where you are, that can be very evident, or there's bits of America that, where that's not evident at all, but generally speaking. Yeah. Now, again, we won't get into the methodological details about how you ask questions and phrasing and things like that. But certainly on the face of it, I mean, the British numbers were not great. Like, don't get me wrong, all right? But they looked better, which is always, always good. The really interesting thing that comes out of the British numbers is that the younger ones are more kind of orthodoxly believing than older Catholics. And actually, this is critical because there's two things going on here. Well, two or three, but I think the two big ones is, one, precisely what we said before, at that age, at that level of kind of secularized world that they've grown up with, a high proportion of their peers will no longer even tick a box. Right? So there's a sense in which that inflates the numbers because all the weaker and more kind of culturally attached people, we don't even have those anymore. Now that's not a good thing, right? The fact that you've lost that people baptized Catholic or whose parents were baptized Catholics are so distant that they no longer even tick a box, right? There's not a lot of kind of spinning that as a good thing. No. However, other than what we're about to do, which is to say that the side effect of that is that precisely what we've just said, the ones who are left have to be more committed. And in a sense, that's what you want. You want people who are there for a reason, who know what they believe, and who kind of hang out with others and get married to them, and or just have that kind of supportive network of peers. Who also believe very weird countercultural things as far as the wider culture is concerned. So I think essentially what we're probably seeing in the British data is that we're getting to a point where kind of secularization is going to bottom out, right? You can't go on forever, right? We've had 50, 60 years of it. You get to a certain point when the people who are left are there for a reason, and that's precisely the kind of group where you might see growth again. Plus, immigration helps a lot.
Because I mean, those numbers that one would read sort of in 50 years' time, if current trends continue, there will be no Catholics left. That doesn't work like that.
Present trends never continue, right?
Okay,
present trends just don't continue for huge long periods. There was a study that got quite a lot of attention in the press last year, I think, which was a very interesting way of modelling different denominations' growth and decline. But that's where that kind of, by 2063, the last Catholic, that for a start, it doesn't take into account immigration. The Catholic Church in this country has, for the past 200 years, been constantly topped up by immigration. Now, that's cheating in a sense. That's true.
We're reaping where we did not sow.
Yeah, exactly. But well, to be fair, we did so, and then they've come back to us, or at least Ireland did for us, right?
In Africa as well.
Yeah. So there is an element of that, but the other thing about that is that you get to the point where the people who are left have to be there and have to be more tenacious, and will. Again, if you meet young, if you go to Youth 2000 or something, or any of these kind of young groups, Juventutum or New. I mean, I don't even know what the groups are because I'm too old, right? But you're gonna find bright young professionals who are committed to the faith, who are probably having more kids earlier than their peers, and are trying to form their kids in a very difficult situation in a much more intentional way. And actually that will start to have a slow, gradual kind of bounce back. And it won't suddenly bounce back to where it was, that's just not going to happen, and there's so much has changed. But we're beginning to see this, and I think this isn't just a Catholic thing. If you go to, an evangelical church in the middle of London, Holy Trinity Brompton, for example, it's the same, it looks very different, but it's the same kind of inner dynamics as you'll see at the Brompton Oratory next door, right? It's a very weird thing to be an evangelical or a practicing Catholic, right? Yeah. But a big city like London has plenty of them, and if they gather together and congregate and are sufficiently committed, then they start to attract others.
I mean, is this the sort of vision that Pope Benedict laid out, I think, well, it must have been already in the sort of 60s.
Late 50s.
Yeah. So of a smaller church that, in a sense, couldn't depend on its kind of cultural capital and even institutional capital of the past. And, you know, that meant, to a certain extent, losing some of maybe the buildings, the institutions, but having a kind of rump of people who were kind of fully committed. I mean, I see that in my own children. You know, they've taken this kind of very countercultural decision to practice their faith. And so for them, it's like, well, if we're going to do that, we're not going to do that just for... we might as well go the whole hog. You know, we might as well believe in the weirder things. And they're way more interested in, you know, scapulars and miracles and things than I ever was, because they've kind of embraced the whole of it.
No, I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So that, you know, and if you reread those early essays from the 50s and late 60s as well, there's two very famous ones that often get quoted. You know, he talks about, you know, there'll be a time when, you know, Christians could no longer afford to inhabit the structures built in better times. Well, how many churches are we selling or need selling? I mean, it's that precisely that kind of, and it's a side effect of secularization. It's a byproduct. It's not like secularization isn't happening because, look, there's some young committed Christians. They're the side effect of secularization and what happens after secularization. And it's also true, and you see this, and it's kind of those kind of... you certainly see this with younger clergy, but younger... you know, I see this at St. Mary's, you know, if you go to Mass. You know, girls, young women rather, you know, wearing mantillas, you know, or people rediscovering the rosary. Stuff that, like, is hardly, you know, like radical stuff for their great-grandmother's generation now.
Kind of kneeling for communion.
Yeah, exactly, all that kind of stuff. But is seen and is embraced as this, well, if we're going to be Catholic, we're going to be properly Catholic, right? What does that mean? And there's a brilliant doctoral thesis by another former student of mine who's now a colleague at St. Mary's, Susan Longhurst, who did a doctorate interviewing people who were joining the Catholic Church, who were going through the RCIA in a particular year in Southwark. And she found with them, like, they all, you know, they were obviously making a really kind of a weird culturally thing to, you know, go to the effort to become Catholic. And they wanted to be Catholic. And she says that every single one of them she interviewed mentioned the rosary, even if she didn't ask. And she got to the final interview and thought, oh, there's one who hasn't mentioned the rosary. And then they're like, oh, one more thing. And it's things like that. Things that in the past were seen as kind of distractions and extras and accretions and things that distracted you from the Mass, which was the whole point. We get rid of the devotions so people can focus more fully. Yeah. But actually, it was sociologically, anthropologically naive, because actually that's the scaffolding that actually...
I mean, it was very interesting. A few years ago, when Adoramus took place in Liverpool, and I remember going to Adoration in Liverpool Cathedral. And the cathedral is completely wrong for adoration, you know, in the sense that most of us was kind of sitting to the side of the monstrance and all the rest of it. And you kind of realised that when that cathedral was built, it was definitely built with the idea that probably adoration wouldn't really be taking place anymore. You know, it was only built for a certain idea of how the Mass would be celebrated. And the rest, I think, you know, we'd probably decided was going to be left behind. Now, adoration seems to have had a big comeback, especially among the young. And I think that's kind of borne out in the statistics that you've been speaking about, which is that, you know, that Eucharistic faith tends to be strongest among the practising young.
Because else, why would you do it?
Yeah.
Why would you go to Mass? I mean, it's not... I'm not saying it can't be, but it's not the most riveting hour of your life at a normal parish Mass. And it's not that you don't go for the music, and, you know, you probably don't go for the, you know, the community. A lot of parishes, you go because you think Christ is truly...
You get the donuts.
Exactly. You don't... I mean, I went...
Teas in
I was in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and I went to Hillsong.
Yeah, right, okay.
And they do it very well. And, like, you know, it's the production values, the music, the coffee afterwards. But, unless it's... If you believe Christ is really present and obliges you to be there, then you can put up with a lot.
I mean, the big problem, I suppose, and I think you've mentioned it in your work, and I seem to remember reading it in a French sociologist's kind of statistical analysis of what was happening, especially around Vatican II, was that the things that we do within the church are just part of what is, exercising an influence on the people who come to church, because we're in the world. So in a sense, if we talk about what happened at and after Vatican II, in a sense, it was like the very worst time to start kind of experimenting a bit with the liturgy. Do you want to say something a bit about that and the problems of looking at the direction things are going in when you have kind of multiple...
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is always going to happen in history, right?
Yeah.
You can't just kind of conduct an experiment and, what were the causes of whatever war or, like anything like that. There's always going to be a lot going on and you're trying to make sense of an awful lot, right? So this is a book I wrote a few years ago called Mass Exodus, where I kind of lay out this. But basically, it had struck me that there's kind of three basic ways of accounting for... kind of Catholic decline since the mid-1960s. And if you look at the chart, I mean, it's very clear.
We're talking Catholic decline in the West,
yeah, particularly in Britain and America. France would be, Germany, Belgium. Not everywhere, by no means everywhere, but certainly much of, not every, Ireland has a very different trajectory. Malta, it's not just Western Europe, but predominantly large parts of Western Europe, North America, Australia, and other bits. Okay, so a good, fair chunk of the world. Not nowhere. And there's kind of three main competing schools. One is to say that everything's the council. Blame everything on the council. The council ruined everything. If there hadn't been a council, everything would be great. This is all caricatures of these three positions. The other one is to say, not enough council, right? That the council was thwarted, that there was a conservative, often Humanae Vitae, or the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, that the council wasn't allowed to have the new Pentecost that you'd expect the effects of a new Pentecost to be, because it was stifled and betrayed and undermined and that kind of stuff. And then there's a third set, and if you read kind of, mainstream sociology of religion, there doesn't seem to be a particularly Catholic story to tell. It's, okay, maybe, lots of denominations around this time start declining. Maybe there's a bit of Catholic colour you can add, but basically Catholicism is just like one more data point, right? Now, what I wanted to do with Mass Exodus is essentially to say all three are right. Like, first of all, the decline's big enough that, you can slice the pie up and there's plenty to go around. Right. But equally, all of these three things interact in very complex ways. So it can both be the case that the way that, as you said before, if you had to pick a moment in the past, however many hundred years, to do some judicious pastoral tinkering in kind of laboratory conditions, everything, all other things being equal, the 1960s probably wasn't the time you'd have picked. Now, that's no one's fault, right? You're like, John 23rd didn't sort of see what was happening, although one of the arguments I make in Mass Exodus is that the reason the council is called, a large part of what motivates the council, particularly Sacrosanctum Concilium, is a sense that there is this growing pastoral crisis. And if you read, we talked about Ratzinger in the 50s, but he's not alone. I mean, you've got, Brana says the same thing in the 50s, you've got Alfred Delp in the 40s, if you read Congar or de Lubac in France, if you read people in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Italy, people are saying, look, we're losing the young people, we're losing the working classes. Paul VI was deeply concerned about losing the working class of Milan. John the 23rd, when he was nuncio in Paris, in the 40s, was, deeply grieved that there's millions of souls absent from the church. So these ideas were in the air. So it's not that everyone thought everything's great, let's make it even more great. There was a real sense that, The writing's on the wall. We need to do something now. Now, what then happened and the way it played out, and it's that kind of law of unintended consequences, because it's one thing to say, well, we're going to make these changes and it's going to be implemented in this way. And then there's this kind of period of chaos after the council where, from Sunday to Sunday, you've no idea what's going on. And from parish to parish, you've no idea what's going on. And so the way in which it played out at a very turbulent period was not ideal, particularly because you had this generation, the baby boomers. There was an awful lot of them, and they all came of age, which is always a turbulent time of, finding yourself and moving around and not being in one place for any one time. When did the baby boomers all come of age? Mid-1960s. So it's a kind of a perfect storm, and by the time they settle down, everything's changed. By the time they kind of okay, we should probably, take the kids to mass or whatever in the 70s, 80s. Totally different to what, and so there's a lot going on.
But in a sense, I suppose what was happening was reflecting that very real sense of change in the world as well. 1968 just seems to be that kind of that hinge point at which so many things change, both inside the church and to an even greater extent maybe outside the church. Just been published a very short introduction to Vatican II,
and one of the things we point out there is that it's convened less than nearer to the end of the Second World War than 9/11 is to us as we're speaking now, right? So it's all very fresh. End of the Holocaust, the devastation wreaked in Europe. Real kind of apocalyptic kind of stuff.
Cities were probably still, in ruins.
Yeah, you talk to, like my parents' generation, raised 40s, 50s, not necessarily them, but their contemporaries in other cities, talk about playing on kind of bombed out whatevers, Plus, the council begins, and I think, within the first couple of weeks, you got the Cuban Missile Crisis. You got all there's an awful lot happening. In the 1960s, plus sexual revolution, plus Bob Dylan going electric, it's all kinds of stuff, right? So
that's really where the rot set in.
Well, I make that point in the book, is that you could equally have called it Catholic disaffiliation since Bob Dylan went electric.
No, I mean, so in that sense, I mean, there's no. I mean, I think those ideas of the end of history and the fact that a lot of things happened then, less things are happening now. That's all sort of disappeared really in the last few years. I think sort of beginning with coronavirus and going, into the sort of perma-crisis that we've been living in over the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, you also did some work on COVID, and I mean, I felt very much that COVID moment was like a huge missed opportunity for the church, in the sense that we, all of a sudden, sickness and death is being spoken about constantly, and if there's one thing that the church knows how to speak about, it's about sickness and death, and we sort of fluffed our lines.
The last thing.
Yeah, exactly. We fluffed our lines. I mean, you looked at some of the numbers there, and I think you have since. What would you say has been the? I mean, I suppose it's too early to say the lasting effects, but what were the kind of immediate effects, and what have you seen kind of since?
Well, so by, I think 2019, so the October count in 2019, I think the mass attendance was about 700,000 in England and Wales, which is a lot less than it used to be, but 700,000 is quite a lot of people. Right? 2022, it was 500,000. Now, presumably by now, people who are coming back after COVID are back. Yeah. So that's 200,000 people. Some of those, partly it's people dying, and but then it's like the new people not coming in. Now, if you look at the trajectory over the past decades, there's always a small. No, I think habits. Virtue is a habit, right? This is classic Aristotelian stuff. And habit. There's a whole sort of sociological literature on habits and changes to habits, status quos, bias, and things like this. And anything that changes. So often when people move house, if they don't kind of find a new church within however many weeks, just kind of get out of the habit, and they keep meaning to. There's a period when they kind of keep, well, we must go next week, and then it never happens. Now the trouble with COVID is that it was not only that original lockdown, but then we had this really weird period of like suddenly like things were closed, or I had a period of turning up you'd be like, finally, we'll get the kids back to mass. It's been, and then you get there and they'd lock the doors. Like I always get out of the house at late because there was chaos in my house. But you'd get to mass at like 2 minutes past 9, and they'd lock the doors, and it's like we've just done all this.
Is that? I mean, do you feel like it just kind of moved us along a trajectory that we were on anyway? It hastened the exit of people who were probably on their way out.
Yeah, I mean,
anyway.
I think to a significant extent that's the case. So what we had before the pandemic was that lots of dioceses had done their pastoral plan. By 20 years from now, if present trends continue, we'll have this number of clergy, these number of congregants, and we need to think about merging parishes, which is a very prudent and sensible thing for bishops to be doing. I've not spoken to the people who make those kind of pastoral plans, but I expect a lot of those calculations have been suddenly pulled forward 5-10 years. And I think that's a big part of it. So certain people who were either just older people, a lot of people died. I mean, that's the other thing. And the people who died were most likely to be the kind of demographics who are most likely
going to church.
Going to church, right? So that's going to have an effect. Every congregation will have had a few people who have died who wouldn't have died yet.
Yeah.
But also aren't immortal, weren't going to be there forever. I think at the other end, the more worrying long-term trend is that thing about taking kids to mass. There'd be a lot of families who were going to mass before the pandemic and got out the habit, and probably by now have accepted that they're probably not going to get back into that habit, but would have had a period when they meant to get back. They didn't suddenly think, right, now we don't have to go to mass.
Yeah.
They were kind of like, we really ought to, but it's... And now they do something different on a Sunday.
There's
a different thing.
But
the kids are like, what is this mass you speak of? It's a totally unfamiliar... it's bad enough getting my kids to mass. And I think, sure, you've been to hundreds of masses in your life. You ought to at least by now have sort of accepted that this is a thing that happens every Sunday, right? It comes around every Sunday. If you've not had that for 2 years, or some of the kids won't remember ever having done it, it's a very big thing to suddenly start. And also, we know that the biggest predictor of adult religiosity is religious practice in the home, right? And the disruption of that, even if it's just the COVID period, it's kind of a slow drip, and the knock-on effects of a lot less of that, in 20, 30 years' time, we don't know. But no, what it does mean is that the 500,000 are the are the hardcore, because of every reason not to still be going after a pandemic, and they are.
I mean, one sort of effect that certainly COVID seems to have had, whether it can be directly attributed to COVID or whether it just happens to have happened at the same time, is that you've seen a kind of big drop-off in kind of fertility rates across, certainly across the Western world, and even in other places where fertility rates have been higher. I mean, I do wonder whether we've got to a point where there's a sort of civilizational kind of, maybe a kind of just a lack of confidence in the future, a lack of confidence in sort of where we're going, that has meant that we are, in a sense, as a society, not so. We're not able to kind of invest in the future, and if the kids aren't there, then what?
Yeah, I mean, you do. I mean, you hear people say this all. Why would you have children in a world like this? All because of climate, carbon footprint. So there's clearly a significant segment of young people who 2 generations ago would have had 4 or 5 kids, right? Now we're having 1 or none, or something like that.
Yeah.
And actually, that's quite a significant demographic reality. And there's certain the people. I'm no expert on Japanese demographics, but people always say that this is a country that's having very serious problems with kind of paying pension. Because there aren't enough young people working to support. And there's loneliness and all sorts of issues. There's also a lot of people, I think, because of work, understandably delay and then have problems.
Yeah.
And that there's all sorts of...
was it unintended childlessness?
Yeah, no, my wife's always evangelising NFP to help you get pregnant.
Right. Yeah.
Just fertility tracking and that kind of stuff, for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, because people think it'll just sort of happen by itself, but then after a certain age, it's probably worth sort of knowing exactly what's happening. And
then there's this whole secular world of period tracking and stuff and all sorts of stuff and keeping it kind of anti-big pharma, organic. They've kind of rediscovered natural family.
Yeah,
planning.
I mean, one thing I thought was interesting is that when we look at these stats, and they're not great, but the response of the church. I mean, when the church kind of tries to put in these 5-year plans and stuff, I mean. I think, and even things like the Eucharistic revival. I mean, immediately, as soon as that came out, I saw any number of articles saying, this stuff doesn't work. This is not how these kind of imposed from above solutions are not the ones that are going to make any difference. And I mean, in a sense, looking back at the history of the church, the response to any number of crises has always been that saints have kind of arisen within the church and have responded. And I mean, that's a very difficult thing. It'd be very difficult for a bishop's conference to kind of sit down and say, okay, we let's plan for some new saints.
Yeah, well, you say that. I mean, I've always half planned to write a book called How to Make Saints and Evangelize People. That isn't about how you make saints, but about how families and indeed churches could kind of increase the odds. And I think it's about kind of gaming the odds, or for churches to think, well, I mean, this is the classic case. It's look, we've got certain, young people, young families who are quite a precious commodity in our churches, especially people with lots of kids. Yeah. What could we be doing to support them and help them and encourage them? Because that's their kids, and helping them to keep a higher proportion of those kids practicing into the next generation is really mission critical for the church.
Also because I think in my younger days I was very confident that there was a sort of demographic solution to all of this. The faithful Catholics were the ones that were going to have loads of kids, and therefore those kids were going to be the ones who were going to grow the church in the future. And to a certain extent that is the case. But there's also, I remember listening to a Ross Douthat talk a few years ago where he was saying, well, look, that's all very well, but you got to see that also the society around us is very willing to take our children and kind of initiate them into their way of thinking. They won't have their own children, can't be bothered, but they don't mind taking ours. And you see that in a sense through the kind of indoctrination that happens in universities. And I think Bishop Barron's always spoken about that is the moment at which many Catholics, Catholic young people kind of lose their faith as well. Although obviously you're
or people example. Find it, because the flip side, and actually the interesting thing here is that when you get to a certain point in secularization, where the people who in a previous generation would have rebelled against the conservative Christianity of their upbringing are the kind of people who rebel against whatever the status quo is.
So the children of the hippies' ultimate rebellion is become a Catholic.
Exactly. So there's that kind of... So the sort of... It's what we talk... That kind of countercultural, embracing a radically kind of weird set of values and way of life could well be becoming, kind of homeschooling Catholics, right?
Well, that's very interesting, because in terms of... I read somewhere that a very large number of vocations to the priesthood in America, for example, are coming from homeschooling families. So already there's been a kind of a grassroots kind of change in the kind of the pipeline that I think nobody planned, but has just
well, yeah, and that's what I mean about increasing the odds. I mean, it's a bit like that with vocations. Is that like and again, this is one of there's a whole big thing about. I think we're very good about thinking about how grace and nature interact at an individual level, like theologically, right? Grace perfects nature. It's not in kind of competition, right? I think we're very bad at thinking about how that kind of works socially. But it's because people just think, well, you can't do it. It's all great, like vocation. It's all God, right?
Yeah.
True to an extent, but and conversions as well.
You can put your finger on the scale.
Exactly. So it's all about what, and which brings us round to one of the books I'm writing at the moment with Hannah Vaughan Spruce, who I've mentioned, and Bernadette Durkin, who's a current doctoral student of mine, is precisely looking at the present state of the church in Britain, and we've written plenty of books about decline, looking at what's working now, where are the kind of the stories of resilience and kind of vitality and hope and growth underneath the big term, the sort of the top line statistics. And thinking about, well, what does that mean for the future of the church? But also, what should the church now, institutionally or kind of as individuals, be doing to kind of lean into some of this, to help support these communities, to kind of, and again, it may be that, when secularization bottoms out, it can either bottom out there or it can bottom out there, and that's a much better basis to start growing than there. Yeah. Even though both are much lower than, it's that kind of thing. And I think we need to kind of be quite mindful about, the task of the church today is putting the next generation into the best possible fighting fit situation, which is not going to suddenly be, 80% of the population, not going to be close. It's going to be very small, but it can be, there are degrees of small. It's kind of,
and in a sense, even the examples that Christ gave of the salt of the earth or the leaven. Yeah. I mean, that was never supposed to be. It was never supposed to be kind of all salt or all leaven.
No, exactly. And there is that kind of equipping today's Christians, but therefore Catholics specifically, we're most interested in. But it's the same sort. Everyone's having these problems. It's the same kind of thing. If you talk to evangelicals, they're going to have exactly the same kind of or you talk to Mormons. You have very similar. Talk to Muslims. You have very similar conversations about the state of the country, worrying about the kids. Things aren't what they used to be. What can we be doing? And it's all about what can we be doing now, but kind of thinking as to what will get us into a better position for them to get into a better position for them. Because and actually this is the thing that worries me a bit about the new evangelization is that it's going to be a long, hard slog, and we need a kind of a spirituality of grit and perseverance. And John Henry Newman's very good on it. Lead Candy Light is quite good, but there's much more things where he talks about like the need to keep going even though you've got very little to show for it. And he talks about the prophet Jeremiah, who starts out, he's got every reason to think he's going to have this glittering success. He's called for it as a child. It looks to be quite a good time in Israel to kind of do stuff. He's got God himself is like on his side. Surely he's going to like have this like great success, and he ends it in this kind of very bad state at the end. This kind of dejected, disappointed, what looks outwardly like a failure, but actually, in certain times and places, this is kind of what we're called to do, and to keep going even though it's uphill, which of course it is at the moment.
So, despite having kind of tracked the decline, tracked disaffiliation, you haven't lost hope.
No, and as I say, a lot of it is the side effects of secularization. It's not that it's not to say that and you do sometimes encounter this. People say, people aren't really. It's not that we're less religious; we're just differently religious, and X proportion of people believe in something. Well, we're not called to get people to believe in a vague, benevolent something. That's not at all what the church should be taking as a win, right?
Yeah.
So but I do think that there gets to a point in secularization when you can't keep secularizing forever.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not to say that the bounce back suddenly leaps back up, but actually, and it won't just be Catholics; it'll be other religious groups, all of which should probably kind of see themselves as in the same sort of boat against a much bigger secular culture. But I think this is when you start to see, growth.
Yeah, because in a sense, I suppose your journey in the faith sort of began during that period of, the big boom of the new atheists that have kind of run out of steam a little bit, and those questions of meaning, which were either kind of put to one side or ignored, have certainly seemed to have kind of resurfaced. And are spoken about. I don't know if that's just the algorithm that I've got on YouTube, but it certainly seems to be something that people are willing to speak about in a lot more detail than maybe a few years ago.
Yeah, and the church needs to be, when there are those people asking those questions, the church needs to be there, in that space.
Yeah.
And in fact, speaking of YouTube algorithms, a former colleague of mine, friend of mine, used to be a evangelical. I don't think he'd been much before, became an evangelical. He's a philosopher, used to write his, whatever he was doing, marking or something with kind of YouTube apologetics videos on in the background. And then the algorithm started serving up Bishop Barron.
Right.
Now he's a Catholic.
Okay.
And yeah, so there's all sorts of stuff in.
But you've got to be there.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to have Bishop Barron in the mix to be served up by the algorithm or whatever, right? Yeah. And I think, there's all sorts of ways in which the church could be. I thought of this during COVID because you said precisely, if people are dying, and we've been very fortunate in our bit of the world and our time and place that most people most of the time are buffered from serious kind of mortal questions, right? And suddenly they were very close to home. And it struck me, what if people, and you look back in history, and those times of crisis are often periods of then religious renewal and often kind of quite weird experimentation, right? But along with that comes kind of, genuine, like the classic thing is the rise of the mendicant orders after a real horror show of a plague and famine and
you've also got sort of doomsday cults.
Yeah, of course. So like the Franciscans and the Dominicans are the kind of the domesticated versions of a really kind of wild, kind of
sort of religious landscape.
Absolutely.
With the background.
And
of
you
the plague
normally might expect that from a global pandemic.
Right.
But
there has been a bit of that, hasn't there?
A bit of it, there has.
Yeah.
But it did strike me that if I was stuck in my room, putting things into Google, kind of big questions, if you put something in Google, you suddenly start getting Facebook ads for whatever, right? Any product, and suddenly, Is the Catholic Church, is there anywhere in the church that's going to stop putting ads at me? And I don't think there is. I never get ads from. I get a lot of targeted ads, and even if they're way off base, I know why they're way off base. I understand. There's a particular brand of dog accessories called Dogmatic. Right. Now I know why I don't have a dog, but I know why the algorithm thinks, hey, he mentions Dogmatic a lot. Let's give him dog accessory adverts. But never. And maybe if I lived in London, it'd be different. Never get church talk. And if there's one thing big tech knows about me, it's that I'm interested in church stuff. And I always think there's things like that, for any one parish in any one place, resourcing that isn't going to suddenly double a congregation, but actually 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, you could actually, and you always get this with any convert stories, it's like providence, accident, it looked like, viewed in one way, it's pure, like me going to university and, 3 weeks in and I could only do theology and then that leads a thing. In one sense, that's accidents. In another sense, it's providence,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
I can tell a theological story about God drawing straight with crooked lines, right? And I always think that what the church needs to be doing is to maximise the accidents for grace to trip people up. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I think that's a lovely place to stop. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your wisdom and your research with us. And I'm really glad to see that you're kind of full of hope and giving us some real practical advice to where we should go. I think even for us as an organisation at CTS, that we've got to be there when those questions are asked. That's kind of, I suppose, what we're hoping that the algorithm can serve up this
podcast,
this conversation as well. So thank you so much. Thank you to all our listeners and to our viewers. Do subscribe and share this as far and wide. And thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.